Have you ever watched the precise moment a king understood that the throne he bled for, the crown he carried like a second spine through war and winter and sleepless decades, was never the thing he should have feared losing? Not the crown, not the kingdom, not the loyalty of thousands who once chanted his name like a war cry, but the love of the two people who would have followed him into the mouth of hell itself. By the time Alpha King Thorne Blackwind understood that truth, the door had already closed behind it. Moonfang Palace was dying. The ancient fortress had endured nearly 4 centuries above the cliffs overlooking the Frostfang Sea. Its black stone walls had absorbed invasions, civil wars, winter famines, blood feuds that had erased entire bloodlines from the memory of the living. It had survived everything. Yet tonight it looked like a monument to failure. The banners of House Blackwind hung in tatters from the vaulted ceiling of the throne room. Strips of black and silver cloth drifted on the cold wind that slipped through shattered stained glass windows, slow and spectral, like the kingdom itself was already becoming a ghost. The great council table lay overturned. Chairs lay broken across the marble floor. Their legs snapped like arguments that had gone too far. Ancient wolf carvings, symbols of pack unity that had watched over 3 generations of Blackwind kings, sat cracked and blackened by smoke. The torches along the walls had burned out hours ago. No servants remained to relight them. No guards stood watch. No nobles huddled in anxious clusters. No counselors argued over policy at the hour it mattered most. No pack members gathered to hear their king speak. The throne room of the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories was empty. Almost. At the center of the hall, illuminated only by pale moonlight falling through the ruins of what had once been spectacular windows, knelt Alpha King Thorne Blackwind. 7 years earlier, entire armies had trembled at the sound of his footsteps on stone. Enemy alphas had surrendered before the first blade was drawn. Kings twice his age had chosen diplomacy rather than risk learning firsthand what defeat at his hands felt like. His name alone had once been enough to silence entire courts. Tonight there was no one left to fear him. The king knelt motionless before the Iron Moon throne, his broad shoulders slumped beneath a heavy cloak stained with snow and ash. The silver wolf crest on his chest was scratched near to ruin. His dark hair, once trimmed with the military precision of a man who controlled everything, now hung loosely around his face, and resting several feet away from him on the cold marble floor was the crown of House Blackwind. Abandoned, forgotten, useless. Thorne stared at it without moving. The crown had cost generations of blood. His grandfather had died defending it. His father had sacrificed everything to secure it. And Thorne himself had spent 20 years expanding its reach across the frozen north. Yet now, staring at the symbol that had once meant everything to him, he felt something he had never expected. Nothing. No pride, no triumph, no satisfaction. The place where those feelings had lived was occupied now by something quieter and more corrosive. Regret. Outside the palace walls, a distant roar rolled through the night. Not a battle cry, not the sound of an uprising come at last to his gates. Something worse. A chant. Thousands of voices moving together, swelling into something that shook the windows in their frames. Thorne closed his eyes, because he already knew the name they were calling. Lyra. The sound rolled across the city like the tide coming in. Inevitable, patient, unstoppable. Lyra. Again. Stronger. Lyra. The people were not calling for their king. They were calling for their queen. The woman who had walked away from him 7 years earlier. The woman he had accused of betraying the crown. The woman he had believed in the stubborn, irrational way of powerful men who cannot conceive of being wrong would eventually return to him. The woman who never did. Another wave of voices crashed through the night. Lyra, Lyra, Lyra. The chant spread beyond the palace walls, beyond the city, beyond the kingdom itself, carried by travelers and merchants in the kind of story that travels faster than any royal decree. The people no longer spoke of Alpha King Thorne Blackwind. They spoke of Queen Lyra Ashbourne, the queen who had stood with starving villages when the crown sent soldiers instead of food, the queen who had protected families when authority failed them, The queen who had become the heart of a kingdom after its king forgot what it meant to be human. A bitter smile touched Thorne's lips. Years ago, she had warned him. He could still hear her voice with the terrible clarity that haunts only the truths we refuse to hear. You think loyalty comes from fear. The memory cut through him like something physical. But fear only keeps people beside you until they stop being afraid. He had dismissed her. He had believed strength was enough. He had believed that authority, properly wielded, was its own kind of love. He had believed being right mattered more than being present. The kingdom had spent 7 years proving him wrong in every way a kingdom can. Heavy footsteps echoed through the empty hall. Thorne didn't turn. He recognized the weight of them, the measured, deliberate tread of a man who had walked into hard rooms for 30 years without flinching. Royal Commander Garrick Voss. The old warrior moved slowly through the darkness. His steel armor bore fresh scratches. His weathered face looked older than it had only months ago. Not from age, but from the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you respect dismantle themselves, one decision at a time. For a long moment, he remained silent. The old commander had delivered countless reports during his years of service. Victories, defeats, assassinations, wars, deaths. Yet somehow, standing here in this ruin of a throne room felt harder than all of them. Finally, he stopped several feet behind the kneeling king. Neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them like something physical. Outside, the crowd continued chanting. Inside, the throne room felt like a tomb. Then Garrick inhaled deeply. My king. The title sounded strange now. Not wrong, just fragile. Like something already slipping away. Like a handhold crumbling beneath weight it was never meant to hold. Thorne didn't look up. What is it? His voice came out rough. Emptied. The voice of a man who understood that no news arriving in this room tonight could possibly be good. Garrick hesitated, just long enough for dread to begin creeping through the silence, like cold air under a door. Then he spoke. We found him. For the first time all night, Thorne moved. His head lifted, only slightly, but it was enough. Enough to reveal the thing he had carried hidden beneath his silence for 7 years. Hope. Raw. Dangerous. Desperate. The kind of hope a drowning man feels when he imagines he sees the shore. For 7 years, that hope had refused to die. Despite everything. Despite the silence. Despite the distance. Despite a hatred he had earned through choices he could not undo. Thorne's voice barely cleared a whisper. Cassian? Garrick nodded. Prince Cassian is alive. The words struck the king the way lightning strikes. Sudden. Total. Lighting everything up at once. Alive. His son was alive. Not dead beneath frozen earth. Not lost in some province nobody had thought to check. Not buried in a consequence the king himself had set in motion. Alive. The air caught in Thorne's lungs. Memories broke through him like water through cracked stone. A small boy racing through palace corridors waving a wooden practice sword. Laughter that never seemed to find an ending. Questions that came in unceasing streams from a child who still believed his father knew all the answers. A child who once thought his father could do no wrong. For one brief, suspended moment, something inside the king, something that had been sealed shut for 7 years, cracked open. Then Garrick finished speaking. But he refuses to see you. The hope died so quickly it was almost cruel. Thorne froze. The words reverberated through the ruined hall. He refuses to see you. Not can't. Not won't today. Not later when things settle. When time has done something to soften what was broken. Refuses. The distinction was devastating. Because hatred still required emotion. Hatred still meant you were worth hating. Refusal meant something worse. It meant the door had been considered, and deliberately, consciously, permanently closed. Slowly, Thorne lowered his head again. Outside, the people continued chanting Lyra's name. Inside, the king sat in the silence left behind by his son. And for the first time in 7 years, he stopped fighting the truth he had spent every waking day trying to outrun. His enemies had not taken the throne. His pack had not betrayed him. His son had not abandoned him without reason. He had done it to himself. One decision. One choice made in pride rather than love. One moment when he had looked at his family, and chosen power instead, and called it wisdom. And that single choice had cost him everything: his throne, his pack, his queen, his heir. The kingdom knew the ending. The people knew the consequences, but very few remembered where it all began. 7 years earlier, before the broken banners, before the abandoned throne, before the chants that shook the palace windows in the dark, before Prince Cassian disappeared, before Queen Lyra walked away without once looking back, before Alpha King Thorne Blackwind became the loneliest man in the Northern Territories, he stood at the absolute height of his power, and he was about to make the worst decision of his life. 7 years earlier, long before Moonfang Palace became a monument to regret, long before the throne room stood abandoned, long before the kingdom turned its back on the man who had united it, the Blackwind Dominion stood at the height of its power. To outsiders it looked eternal, invincible, unshakable. And perhaps that was the beginning of the problem, because kingdoms rarely collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they become convinced they cannot. The first light of dawn spilled across the Frostfang Sea, painting the black cliffs surrounding Moonfang Palace in shades of silver and cold gold. The ancient fortress loomed above the capital like a sleeping giant, its massive walls reaching toward a sky that had not yet decided whether to offer sun or storm. Beneath it, the city of Stormhold was already awake. Merchants filled the streets. Blacksmiths hammered glowing steel, the sound ringing out across the cobblestones like a heartbeat. Children raced through crowded market squares. Ships arrived from distant ports carrying spices, grain, silk, and gold, the spoils of a kingdom others envied and wise men feared to challenge. The kingdom was prosperous. The kingdom was strong. And at the center of it all stood Alpha King Thorne Blackwind. From the highest balcony of Moonfang Palace, he watched the city below with the quiet, focused attention of a man who had spent decades learning how to see everything at once and trust nothing until he had. At 42, Thorne was everything the songs claimed: tall, broad-shouldered, scarred by battle in ways that armor never fully concealed. His dark hair carried streaks of silver earned not through age, but through years of warfare that would have broken lesser men. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing. Entire kingdoms had fallen because he noticed details others overlooked. For nearly 2 decades, he had expanded the Blackwind Dominion's borders farther than any ruler before him. He had defeated rival alphas, crushed rebellions, secured trade routes across frozen mountain passes, protected the northern territories from enemies who had once believed the north was theirs to take. The people admired him. His enemies feared him. His soldiers would have followed him anywhere. Yet beneath all his accomplishments lay a belief so deeply rooted that he rarely examined it, the way one rarely examines the foundation of a house one has lived in all one's life. Strength came first. Everything else came second. Compassion had value. Mercy had its place. But only after power was secured. Only after authority was unquestioned. Only after order was maintained. Because that belief had served him well throughout his life, he never considered the possibility that it might someday be the thing that destroyed him. The balcony doors opened behind him. Thorne didn't turn. He recognized the scent instantly, the way you recognize something that has become so familiar it no longer announces itself. Winter roses. Mountain rain. Home. Queen Lyra Ashbourne. Blackwind stepped onto the balcony. Unlike her husband, she wore no armor, no symbols of conquest, no reminders of power. Yet somehow she commanded the room, any room, just as effortlessly as he did. It was a different kind of authority, quieter, more patient, and in ways Thorne had never fully understood, more durable. Her chestnut hair fell freely over her shoulders. The early morning sunlight caught the emerald of her eyes, and for a moment she looked less like a queen and more like something that belonged to the mountains themselves. When Lyra walked through Stormhold, commoners smiled, not because they had to, but because she made them feel seen. When she entered council meetings, arguments softened. When she spoke, people listened, not because they feared her, because they trusted her. That distinction would prove more important than anyone in the kingdom yet understood. Lyra moved beside her husband and looked out over the city. "You're up early." Thorne smiled faintly. A king doesn't sleep much. You slept 3 hours. I slept enough. Lyra shook her head slowly. One day your stubbornness is going to kill you. A rare chuckle escaped him. For 20 years you've been saying that. And one day I'll be right. He looked down toward the awakening city. You usually are. For a moment, the weight of crowns and responsibilities fell away. They were simply husband and wife, watching a city breathe itself awake. A rare luxury, one that would become increasingly rare in the months ahead. The balcony doors burst open again, this time with considerably less grace. A young boy rushed outside. 12 and a half, he immediately corrected anyone who dared round down. Prince Cassian Blackwind skidded to a stop before his parents. His dark hair was in total disarray. His tunic was half-buttoned. A wooden practice sword hung from his belt at an angle that suggested it had been put there in a hurry by someone who was mostly still asleep. "Father!" Thorne turned, and the stern Alpha King, the man whose name made enemy commanders reconsider their career choices, simply disappeared. The father emerged. "You're late," Cassian groaned with theatrical suffering. "I was training." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "You were sleeping." Cassian pointed at her. "Traitor." For the first time that morning, genuine laughter filled the balcony. The prince crossed to his father's side and stood looking out over the city with unguarded admiration in his eyes. One day, all of this would belong to him. The kingdom, the throne, the responsibility, the burden that none of the songs ever mentioned. If anyone had asked him then, Cassian would have answered without hesitation. He wanted to be exactly like his father. That belief would not survive the year. Elsewhere inside Moonfang Palace, down a corridor that the royal family rarely used, in a shadow between two torches that always seemed slightly dimmer than the ones around them, another man was watching the royal family from a distance, Lord Severin Dravenmore. The smile on his face, as always, never quite reached his eyes. Severin was the kind of nobleman people instinctively trusted. Polite, elegant, educated. His words were always measured, his appearance always immaculate, his loyalty always visible. Or at least that was what people were meant to believe. In reality, Severin rarely cared about loyalty. He cared about opportunity. And he had learned long ago that opportunities rarely announce themselves. They arrived disguised as something else, usually as a problem. As he watched the royal family through the distant window, he turned quietly over in his mind the reports already waiting on his desk. Reports from the northern mining territories, food shortages, labor unrest, missing supplies, growing dissatisfaction among the workers. To most rulers, such reports would trigger concern. To Severin, they represented leverage, and leverage was power. Several hours later, the royal council convened inside the great hall. Massive stone columns lined the chamber. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, casting colored light across a floor that had witnessed more history than most kingdoms managed in a lifetime. The banners of dozens of allied packs hung from the rafters. Around the circular council table sat generals, nobles, merchants, and advisors, each of them important, each of them aware of it. At the head sat Thorne. To his right, Lyra. To his left, Commander Garrick Voss, who looked, as he always looked, like a mountain range that had learned to wear armor. Battle scars covered his weathered face. His reputation was legendary. More importantly, he was one of the few people alive who would disagree with the king to his face without flinching. The meeting proceeded normally. Trade routes, border security, military budgets, harvest projections. Then Severin stood. And the room changed in the way that rooms change when someone who is very good at manipulation chooses to begin. "My king." He placed several documents upon the table with the unhurried precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "There have been increasing disturbances in the northern mining settlements." Garrick frowned immediately. Lyra's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Thorne remained calm. "What kind of disturbances?" Severin folded his hands. "Complaints." The word sounded harmless. It wasn't. "Food shortages." Another paper. "Tax disputes." Another. "Minor demonstrations." Another. "Growing dissatisfaction." Silence settled over the chamber. Thorne reviewed the documents. His face remained unreadable. Lyra spoke first. Have inspectors confirmed these reports? Severin nodded smoothly. Our sources are reliable. Garrick narrowed his eyes. Something in the answer bothered him. The way a stone in a boot bothers you, small, persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. What caused the shortages? Severin shrugged. Poor management. Whose? No one specific. The answer felt rehearsed. Garrick noticed. Lyra noticed. Thorne did not, or perhaps he simply saw no reason to question it. After all, the kingdom was thriving. How serious could a few complaints really be? Lyra leaned forward. I think we should investigate personally. Severin smiled with practiced humility. With respect, Your Majesty, sending royal inspectors for every complaint would be impossible. A hungry village is not a complaint. The room fell quiet. Lyra's voice had taken on an edge, something she rarely allowed in public. The kind of edge that comes not from anger, but from patience that has been refused one time too many. Severin quickly lowered his gaze, a perfect performance of contrition. Of course, Thorne finally spoke. We'll monitor the situation. Lyra looked at him, just long enough for something, concern or the quiet beginning of fear, to cross her features. Monitor, not investigate, not intervene. Monitor. A small decision, one that barely registered in the room, one that would eventually change everything. That evening, while the palace settled into its dinner preparations and torches were being lit across the corridors, Prince Cassian slipped through one of the lesser gates beneath the city walls. No escort, no guards, no formal announcement. Just a curious boy of 12 in a plain cloak, with a question that wouldn't let him sleep. The northern reports had bothered him. His mother had seemed worried. Commander Garrick had seemed worried. So why wasn't anyone doing anything? The answer, Cassian decided with the uncomplicated logic of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of the truth, was simple. He would find out himself. 3 days later, after a long and exhausting ride north, the prince reached one of the mining settlements, and everything changed. The village looked nothing like Stormhold. There were no crowded markets, no overflowing warehouses, no signs of prosperity that the capital wore so easily. The homes were weathered and broken. The roads were mud. The people moved with the particular weight of those who have been tired for so long they've forgotten what rest felt like. Cassian watched a woman divide a single loaf of bread among 5 children, parceling it out with the careful deliberation of someone for whom this was not an occasional hardship, but a daily mathematics of survival. He watched miners emerge from tunnels barely able to stand. He watched boys his own age hauling carts heavier than themselves. And most disturbing of all, he heard people whispering about the crown, not with admiration, with fear. The taxes go up every month. My brother lost his farm. We can't survive another winter. They don't care about us. The prince stood frozen. These weren't rebels. These weren't criminals. These weren't the enemies he had heard described in council chambers. The troublemakers, the disloyal, the ungrateful. They were his people. Ordinary, exhausted, frightened people. For the first time in his young life, confusion entered his heart like a splinter, too small to see, too sharp to ignore, because everything he was looking at contradicted everything he had been told. That night, as freezing winds swept across the settlement and the fires burned low, Cassian sat alone beside dying coals. He couldn't stop thinking about the children, the fear, the hunger, the gap between the kingdom he had been shown and the kingdom he was now sitting inside. And one question refused to leave him, no matter how he tried to set it aside. If his father was such a great king, why were his people suffering? Back at Moonfang Palace, Queen Lyra stood beside a large window overlooking the city. The moon hung high above Stormhold, cold and clear. Thorne entered their chambers. Exhaustion weighed on him. The particular heaviness of a man who had not slowed down long enough to recognize how tired he actually was. The council meeting had run for hours. Military reports still awaited review. A border treaty required his personal attention, but one look at Lyra told him she'd been waiting. Worried about Cassian? He asked. Lyra nodded. Then she turned toward him. Her expression was calm. Too calm. the kind of calm that arrives on the far side of a decision already made. Thorne, the king stopped. A kingdom does not fall when enemies attack. The words settled between them like something placed very deliberately on a table. A kingdom falls when its people stop believing in their king. For a moment, silence filled the room. The fire crackled softly. Wind pressed against the glass. And somewhere deep inside Thorne Blackwind, the first warning bell sounded. Distant, uncertain, easy to dismiss. He dismissed it. Because strong kingdoms did not fall. Strong kings did not fail. And tomorrow would simply be another day in a long, successful reign. He did not know that his son was already discovering truths the crown had failed to see. He did not know that Lord Severin's game had already begun in earnest. And he had no way of knowing that the foundation beneath his throne had already begun to crack. The kingdom still looked perfect. The king still looked invincible. The family still appeared whole. But appearances are the last thing to show the damage. And the first fracture had already appeared. The collapse of a kingdom rarely begins with a battle. There is usually no trumpet announcing its arrival, no army massing at the border, no enemy king standing at the gate with a list of demands. Instead, it begins quietly, a lie accepted as truth, a warning ignored one too many times, a decision made by someone powerful enough that no one dares challenge it, until the decision has already become the new reality. In the Blackwind Dominion, those decisions were beginning to multiply. Weeks passed after Prince Cassian's visit to the mining settlements. Then months. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the northern territories. Rivers thawed. Trade routes reopened. The markets of Stormhold remained crowded and loud and full of the particular energy of a city that believes in itself. To most of the kingdom, life appeared normal, prosperous, stable, but far from the capital, beneath the polished surface of royal power, something darker was growing, something patient, something that had learned to move without being seen. And every report that reached Moonfang Palace made that darkness harder to find, because every report passed through Lord Severin Dravenmore. The nobleman had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, not through obvious lies, which invite scrutiny and breed enemies, but through something far more dangerous. Half-truths, distorted truths, selective truths, the kind that are built on something real and then slowly turned until what you're looking at bears almost no resemblance to what actually happened. Inside the royal council chamber, he stood once again before the throne. Stacks of parchment covered the great oak table. Tax records, village complaints, mining reports, military assessments, all carefully organized, all carefully altered. My king! He placed a document before Thorne with the ease of a man who had done this many times. The unrest in the northern territories continues. Thorne glanced down. His expression hardened immediately. The report described attacks on tax collectors, sabotaged supply caravans, threats against royal officials. The words painted a vivid picture. Rebellion, lawlessness, exactly the kind of thing Thorne had spent his entire reign refusing to tolerate. Across the table, Garrick Voss frowned. Something felt wrong. Again. The reports never seemed complete. They answered questions before anyone asked them, pointed blame in the same direction, and somehow every proposed solution required more force, more authority, more control. The old commander cleared his throat. Have we confirmed these incidents independently? Severin smiled. As always, Commander. The answer sounded convincing, yet it contained no actual confirmation, which, if you were paying close attention, was itself an answer. Garrick noticed. Lyra noticed. Thorne did not. If they attack royal officials, they attack the crown. Severin lowered his gaze with respectful gravity. Precisely, my king. Lyra remained silent, but she watched, and she had begun to notice a pattern that she couldn't quite name, but couldn't stop seeing. Every complaint became rebellion. Every disagreement became defiance. Every concern became disloyalty. It was subtle, so subtle that most people in the room missed it entirely. Lyra didn't, because unlike many people in power, she listened not only to what was said, but to what wasn't. And increasingly, what was missing were the voices of the people themselves. Weeks later, a more serious report arrived. The largest mining province in the Northern Territories had refused a new tax increase. Iron Hollow, a province that supplied nearly a third of the kingdom's steel. Without it, military production would slow, revenue would fall, supply chains would weaken. The news sent shockwaves through the capital before the ink on the report was dry. An emergency council session was called. The atmosphere inside Moonfang Palace was tense from the moment the meeting began. Thorne sat at the head of the chamber, unreadable. Lyra occupied her seat to his right, her hands folded. Garrick stood beside the throne, and Severin, across the table, wore an expression that, if you were watching carefully, looked almost like satisfaction. "The province refuses payment?" the king asked. Severin nodded. "The local leaders claim the people cannot afford another increase." Garrick immediately asked the obvious question. "Can they?" The room fell quiet. Severin paused. Only briefly, but long enough for Lyra to notice. The crown's needs must come first. It wasn't an answer, and everyone in the room who was paying attention knew it. Lyra leaned forward. "What exactly are the villagers asking for?" Severin's measured smile tightened slightly at the edges. "They demand reduced taxation. And they want food aid. And," another hesitation, shorter this time, "they request a royal delegation." The queen nodded slowly. There it was, the thing that had been buried under all the language about rebellion and lawlessness and threats to the crown. The people weren't raising armies. They weren't threatening the kingdom. They wanted someone to come and listen. Lyra turned toward Thorne. "We should go." The room looked surprised. Even the king blinked. "Go? To Iron Hollow?" She folded her hands with the calm of someone who has already decided. "If the province is struggling, we should see it ourselves." Garrick immediately agreed. A personal inspection would resolve this quickly. For a moment it seemed the meeting might move in that direction. Then Severin intervened. "My king, with respect, that would be a mistake." Every eye shifted toward him. "The crown cannot appear weak." Lyra's expression hardened. "Listening to your people is weakness?" Severin kept his voice measured, reasonable, the voice of a man who only wants what's best. "No, your majesty, but negotiating with those who are refusing royal law creates a dangerous precedent." Negotiate. Dangerous. Precedent. Every word carefully chosen. Every fear expertly targeted. Severin had spent years studying the architecture of Thorne's pride, and he knew exactly which load-bearing wall to press. The king's jaw tightened. "What do you recommend?" Severin lowered his eyes. "The province must comply." Garrick frowned. Or they must be reminded that law exists for a reason." Silence followed, the kind that fills a room when everyone has understood something they wish they hadn't. Near the rear of the chamber, Cassian sat motionless. He was old enough now to attend council sessions, young enough to still believe that what was said in them should reflect what was true. And as he listened, he remembered Iron Hollow, the children, the miners, the hunger, the exhausted dignity of people who had asked for help and received only suspicion. Nothing about them had felt rebellious. Nothing about them had felt dangerous. They had seemed desperate, not defiant. His gaze moved toward his father. "Please, choose differently." For a moment, Thorne appeared thoughtful. The room held its breath. Then the king spoke. "The province will comply." Cassian's heart sank. "Deploy the royal guard." Lyra closed her eyes. Garrick stared at the table. And Severin, barely, almost imperceptibly, smiled. The kind of smile most people never noticed. But Cassian did. And for the first time, he found himself wondering why a man would smile at a moment like that. The soldiers arrived in Iron Hollow 2 weeks later. What happened next would be spoken of for years. In market stalls and taverns, in letters sent between villages, in whispered conversations that the crown would never fully control. At first, the villagers gathered peacefully. No weapons, no violence, no threats. Only requests for food, for relief, for some acknowledgement that they existed and that their suffering had been seen. But fear is a dangerous thing, and frightened soldiers often see enemies where none exist. One shove became an argument. One argument became a fight. One fight became the thing that nobody wanted and nobody could stop once it began. The situation exploded. Homes caught fire. Families fled into the cold. Children screamed with the particular terror of those who do not yet understand what is happening, but understand perfectly that it is very wrong. Smoke filled the sky above the settlement like a signal, one that traveled in every direction at once. When the violence finally ended, dozens were injured. Several villagers were dead, and the kingdom was horrified in the way that kingdoms are horrified when the thing they feared their rulers might become proves to have already arrived. The story spread faster than any official report. Travelers carried them. Merchants repeated them. Witnesses shared them across every road in the Dominion, and every version made the crown look worse. Inside Moonfang Palace, the atmosphere became something that could be felt in the hallways, a tension that settled into the walls and didn't leave. No one felt it more than Cassian. The images refused to leave him. Burning homes, starving children, terrified families. The faces of people who had once trusted the crown and had been given soldiers in return. Each day the prince struggled more with what he had seen. Each day his father's decisions became harder to understand, until finally he could remain silent no longer. The next council session began normally. Reports, budgets, trade agreements, military updates. Then Cassian stood. The interruption silenced the room immediately. The prince had never challenged council procedure before, never spoken out of turn, never forced the chamber's attention toward himself when it hadn't been offered. Thorne looked up. "What is it?" The room grew very quiet. Cassian swallowed. His heart was beating so hard he was certain people could hear it. But he continued. "They're our people." The words echoed through the chamber with the particular clarity of something simple and true said in a room that has forgotten both those things. No one moved. No one spoke. The prince looked directly at his father. "Why are we treating them like enemies?" The silence became absolute. Every noble in the room stared. Every advisor froze in place. Even Severin appeared caught off guard, and men like Severin are very rarely caught off guard, because this wasn't a private conversation. This wasn't a family disagreement behind closed doors. This was a challenge, public, direct, spoken with the kind of conviction that cannot be dismissed or managed or carefully redirected. Thorne's expression hardened immediately. His voice came out cold, measured. The voice of a king reminding a room who is in charge. A king protects order. Cassian shook his head. "No." The word landed like something dropped from a great height. Several council members exchanged nervous glances. The prince stepped forward, his voice rising, not with anger, but with a kind of desperate conviction. "A king protects people." Nobody breathed. Not Garrick, not Lyra, not Severin. Nobody. Because everyone in the room understood what had just happened. The future king had openly contradicted the current one. Not in private, not in careful diplomatic language, directly in front of everyone, with the entire weight of what he had seen behind every word. Father and son stared at each other across the chamber, neither willing to look away, neither willing to surrender. And for the first time since Thorne Blackwind had taken the throne, someone had spoken a truth he did not want to hear, and the room had heard it too. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No resolution, no reconciliation, only silence. The kind that follows when a crack has appeared in something that was supposed to be solid. That night, Moonfang Palace felt unusually empty. Servants moved quietly. Guards spoke in whispers. Even the wind seemed cautious. Shortly before midnight, Queen Lyra entered her son's chambers. The bed was empty. At first, she thought nothing of it. Then she noticed the open window, the missing travel cloak, the bare weapon rack, and one folded letter resting neatly on the desk, the kind of neat that belongs to someone who has been very deliberate about everything. The queen's heart stopped. Slowly, she picked it up. Slowly, she broke the seal. And as her eyes found the first line, all the color drained from her face, because Prince Cassian Blackwind was gone. And the words he left behind were going to change everything. The future heir to the Blackwind Dominion had disappeared into the night, leaving only a letter, and a kingdom that was about to break. The letter arrived before dawn. Outside Moonfang Palace, darkness still held the city of Stormhold in its grip. The towers stood silent beneath a sky heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided what they intended. The The sea below the cliffs threw itself endlessly against black stone, indifferent to everything happening above it. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, Prince Cassian Blackwin was already beyond reach, beyond the protection of the royal guard, beyond the careful structures of palace life, beyond the control of his father. Inside the royal family's private chambers, Queen Lyra sat motionless beside a dying fire. The folded letter trembled slightly in her hands. She had read it 3 times already. Yet somehow the words found new ways to hurt with each pass. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. And honest words, she had learned, often leave the deepest wounds. Heavy footsteps thundered through the corridor outside. Fast, purposeful, the sound of a man who had been informed of something and was moving toward it before he had decided what to do about it. The doors burst open. Alpha King Thorne Blackwin entered. His cloak was thrown hastily over his shoulders. His expression was already dark with the particular concern of a parent who knows something is wrong before anyone has said a word. The moment he saw Lyra's face, something inside him went very still. What happened? For a moment she almost couldn't speak, not because she feared the truth, because she feared what Thorne would do with it. Slowly she handed him the letter. The king took it. His eyes moved across the page. The room became painfully, utterly silent. Only the fire remained, crackling softly as if it hadn't noticed what was happening. Then came the words that would echo through the kingdom for years. Father, I cannot become the man you want me to be. I have seen what is happening beyond these palace walls. I have seen children go hungry while nobles argue over taxes. I have seen families lose everything while the crown calls them rebels. If being king means learning to ignore their suffering, then I do not deserve the throne, and neither do you. I am leaving. Do not look for me. Cassian. For several seconds, Thorne simply stared. The letter trembled slightly in his hand. Not from fear. Thorne was not a man who trembled from fear, from disbelief, the kind that arrives when reality contradicts what you believed was impossible. His son, his heir, his blood, had abandoned him, not because of enemies, not because of kidnappers, not because of the dozens of dangers that kept a father awake at night, because he no longer believed in him. The realization struck harder than any battlefield wound. But instead of grief, instead of the thing a father should feel, something else rose first. Anger, raw, explosive, the kind that is born specifically from pain that cannot yet admit what it is. Thorne crushed the letter in his fist. He was helped. Lyra remained silent. He couldn't leave the palace alone. Still, she said nothing. And in that silence, in the careful, deliberate absence of a denial, Thorne found his answer. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. The king's eyes narrowed. You knew. The queen slowly stood. I knew. Those 2 words changed everything in the room. The fire crackled, the storm outside intensified, and somewhere inside Thorne Blackwin, pride began winning a battle that reason was already losing. You helped him. Lyra held his gaze without flinching. I protected him. Protected him from what? The queen didn't answer immediately. The hesitation itself became an answer, and Thorne hated it with the specific fury of a man who already knows, somewhere beneath his anger, exactly what the truth is. From becoming someone he would hate. The words landed like a slap. For a moment, even the king seemed stunned. Not because the accusation was entirely unexpected. Some part of him had heard this coming for months. But because it came from Lyra, the one person who had always stood beside him, the one person whose faith, through everything, had never wavered. Until now. You think I'm corrupt? Thorne asked, quietly, the quietness almost worse than shouting. I think you're changing. You think I'm cruel? I think you've stopped listening. The king laughed, a short, hollow sound with no warmth in it. Listening? His voice hardened. While villages refuse taxes? While nobles challenge royal authority? While order collapses around us? Lyra stepped closer. Her voice remained calm, steady. The kind of steady that is not the absence of feeling, but the decision to hold it. No. The moment you started treating every disagreement as betrayal. Thorne looked away. because somewhere deep inside him, beneath the anger, beneath the pride, beneath all the accumulated armor of 20 years of power, part of him knew she wasn't wrong, and admitting that would mean confronting something far more terrifying than any rebellion. It would mean confronting himself. And Thorne Blackwin had spent his entire life conquering enemies, not examining his own errors. He turned toward the window. Storm clouds rolled over the sea. His reflection stared back at him, strong, feared, powerful. And somehow the image felt strange, like looking at a portrait of someone you used to know. Then another voice entered his mind. Severance. The kingdom cannot appear weak. Negotiation encourages defiance. Authority once questioned is authority lost. Those words had been delivered over months, slowly, patiently, consistently, until they had stopped sounding like someone else's opinion and started sounding like his own thoughts. And now they returned, whispering, feeding his fears, feeding his pride, feeding the anger that needed somewhere to go. When Thorne finally turned back toward Lyra, the decision had already been made. Not by wisdom, not by reason, by pride, the most expensive emotion a powerful man can indulge. By sunrise, the entire kingdom was summoned to the Grand Council Hall. The chamber overflowed. Nobles, military officers, pack elders, regional alphas, merchants, governors. Everyone knew something serious had happened. Nobody expected what came next. The great doors opened. Thorne entered first, his expression carved from stone. Behind him came Garrick, who already looked troubled in the way that only someone who knows what's coming can look. Then Lyra, her face calm in the way that takes years of practice to achieve, and costs more than it shows. The king ascended the throne platform. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Thorne spoke. Prince Cassian Blackwin has abandoned the capital. A wave of whispers erupted instantly. Shock spread through the chamber like heat from a fire. The king raised a hand. Silence returned. Then came the words that changed history. This act was not committed alone. Every eye in the room shifted toward Lyra, and for the first time in that hall, real fear appeared on her face. Not for herself, but for what Thorne was about to do, and whether anything could stop him. The king's voice filled the hall. Queen Lyra Ashbourne Blackwin knowingly assisted the prince's departure. The chamber erupted. Gasps, protests, confusion so deep it manifested as sound. Not Lyra. Not the beloved Luna, the woman who had spent years walking among her people without guards, who had organized food shipments during famines, who had sat beside the sick in villages the court had never thought to visit. Not her. Garrick stepped forward. My king! Enough! The command cut through the room like a blade. The old commander fell silent, not because he agreed, but because he understood that challenging the king publicly right now would only worsen something that was already catastrophic. Thorne continued, his voice flat and final. Until a full investigation is completed, Queen Lyra is relieved of all royal authority. The hall froze. Several nobles stood abruptly. Others stared in open disbelief. A few exchanged the kind of horrified look that people exchange when they are watching something irreversible happen and cannot stop it. This wasn't discipline. This was political execution. Lyra's authority was one of the pillars that held the kingdom together. Remove it, and the structure above it would shift in ways that would take years to repair. And everyone in the room knew it, except perhaps the king. One noble rose from his seat, Lord Tiber Ashford, a man who had been loyal to the crown for 3 decades, through wars and disasters and decisions far easier to question than this. My king, surely there is another way. Thorne's gaze found him across the chamber. Cold, sharp, a warning. Do you question my judgment? Lord Tiber sat back down. The message delivered itself without another word. Then came the final order, the one that shattered what remained of the room's composure. Prince Cassian Blackwin is to be located immediately. The king paused. His next words fell like a guillotine. And returned by force if necessary. Even the air seemed to leave the hall. Returned by force, not invited home, not persuaded, not asked to return when he was ready, captured. The distinction horrified everyone, because suddenly it no longer sounded like a father searching for his son. It sounded like a ruler hunting a dissident, and the kingdom, which had been watching very carefully, noticed. The reaction was immediate. Some nobles quietly left the hall. Several military officers exchanged uneasy glances. Messages began spreading across Stormhold before the meeting had even formally ended. The queen had been punished. The prince was being hunted. And the king was growing harder by the day, a stone being compressed into something smaller and denser, and less capable of yielding. By evening, the entire capital was talking. By midnight, the entire kingdom knew. And for the first time in his reign, people questioned whether Thorne Blackwind was still the man they had once admired. Yet the most devastating moment came later, long after the council ended, long after the argument stopped, long after the palace halls emptied and the torches burned low. Queen Lyra entered the royal chambers one final time. The room looked exactly as it always had. The same furniture, the same fireplace, the same view of the sea stretching to the horizon. Yet somehow it felt completely different, because it was no longer home. Thorne stood beside the window. Neither spoke for several minutes. Eventually Lyra approached him, slowly, quietly, without anger, without hatred, without the tears that might have made this easier to watch. The king expected an argument, a plea, some defense of what she had done. Instead, she reached for the silver crescent insignia pinned to her dress, the symbol of the Luna Queen, the symbol she had worn for nearly 2 decades, through every triumph and every difficulty, through everything the crown had demanded of her. Carefully, she removed it. The metal caught the firelight for a moment, glimmering like a fading star. Then she placed it on the table. The sound it made was almost impossibly soft, yet somehow it echoed louder than thunder. Thorne stared at it. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Finally, Lyra spoke. Her voice was calm, heartbreakingly calm, the way the voice gets when someone has made peace with something that should have broken them. "You are no longer fighting for the kingdom." The king swallowed. Something in her tone frightened him more than any accusation, more than shouting ever could, more than an army at the gate. "You are fighting for your pride." Silence, complete and absolute. The words settled between them and stayed. And for one brief, suspended moment, Thorne almost stopped her, almost admitted that he had gone too far, almost chose differently. The part of him that still knew who he used to be reached toward her, toward reason, toward the version of this night where he was capable of humility. Almost, but pride spoke first, and pride always demands payment. Lyra picked up her travel cloak, turned, and walked away. The doors closed behind her, quietly, permanently. The king remained standing alone, convinced he had protected the crown, unaware that he had just lost the thing that made the crown worth protecting. The next morning arrived with consequences, cold, immediate, unforgiving. Commander Garrick entered the throne room carrying a stack of sealed documents. The expression on his face required no explanation. Thorne looked up. "What now?" The old commander placed the papers on the throne, one after another. Resignation, 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 resignation. Thorne stared, then looked up slowly. Garrick's voice was barely above a whisper. "My king." The old warrior hesitated, because even now, after everything, this was a hard thing to say to a man he had served for decades. Then he finished. "Half the council has resigned." And for the first time, a crack appeared in the foundation of Thorne Blackwind's kingdom, a crack that would soon become impossible to stop. There are moments in every ruler's life when the enemy finally reveals itself. Most kings imagine those moments arriving on battlefields, a rival army on the horizon, an assassin stepping from shadow, a traitor drawing steel in the throne room itself. But the most dangerous enemy is rarely the one standing in front of you. Sometimes it sits beside you for years, whispering, advising, guiding, until one day you look up and realize that the hand steering your kingdom was never your own. 3 months after Queen Lyra's departure, Moonfang Palace no longer felt like the heart of a thriving empire. The fortress still stood, the banners still flew, the throne still occupied its place at the center of the Great Hall. But something essential had gone. Life. The corridors had become quieter, council meetings shorter. The laughter that once moved through the royal chambers like something alive was simply gone, and the silence it left behind was a different kind of silence than the palace had ever known before. Even the servants moved differently, carefully, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something that was already cracking. Outside the capital, the situation continued to deteriorate. The mining provinces remained unstable. Trade routes experienced delays. Tax revenues fluctuated. And increasingly, reports arrived describing villages refusing cooperation with royal officials, people who had once accepted the crown's authority and now no longer did. Each report strengthened Thorne's belief that stronger action was necessary, and each report came through the same source, Lord Severin Dravenmore. One rainy afternoon, Commander Garrick Voss sat alone in the royal archives, surrounded by a mountain of documents. The old warrior hated paperwork, always had. He was built for battlefields. Clear objectives, clear enemies, clear victories. Documents rarely offered such certainty. Yet something had been bothering him for months. A feeling, an inconsistency, the kind of small, persistent splinter that lodges deep in an instinct and refuses to be ignored. The reports didn't match what he had seen with his own eyes across the kingdom, and Garrick had survived long enough to know that instincts existed because they deserved attention. So he began digging. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The commander reviewed tax records, mining reports, supply manifests, trade ledgers, inspection documents. Thousands upon thousands of pages. Most appeared normal until they didn't. The first discrepancy was small. A shipment of grain supposedly delivered to Iron Hollow. The records claimed the province had received enough food to sustain its population for 2 months. Yet reports from the exact same period described widespread shortages. Garrick frowned, checked another ledger, another, another. The pattern repeated, again and again and again. The old warrior's stomach tightened, because patterns rarely lie. Late one evening, as rain hammered against the archive windows and the candles burned low, Garrick uncovered something that made everything else make terrible sense. 2 versions of the same report, one stored in provincial records, one submitted to the crown. The contents were completely different. The original described food shortages caused by excessive taxation. The royal version blamed rebellious villagers. Garrick stared at the pages. His pulse quickened. He checked another report. The same. Another. The same. Every single time. The original reports described suffering and requested aid. The official versions described rebellion and demanded punishment. The realization hit him like a warhammer. The crisis had been manufactured. Not the suffering was real, and that made it worse. The narrative had been manufactured. Someone had deliberately, methodically transformed struggling citizens into enemies of the crown. Someone had altered the truth so completely that the king had been making decisions for months, perhaps years, based on a reality that had never existed. And suddenly Garrick knew exactly where to look next. The following morning, he locked himself inside the Treasury archives. This time the answers came faster. Because greed leaves tracks, and greed over time becomes careless. The commander discovered unusual transfers, private accounts, hidden investments, profits that appeared consistently whenever unrest increased. At first, the amounts seemed almost insignificant. Then he followed the money further, and his blood ran cold. Every major conflict in the Northern Territories had one thing in common, one beneficiary, Lord Severin Dravenmore. When taxes increased, Severin shipping companies profited. When villages lost land, Severin acquired property at a fraction of its value. When supply shortages occurred, Severin's merchants sold emergency resources at inflated prices. When military interventions happened, Severin's steel contracts expanded. Every crisis made him richer. Every conflict increased his influence. Every royal decision, made in good faith by a king who believed he was protecting his kingdom, had strengthened Severin's position. The pattern was undeniable. The kingdom wasn't collapsing because of rebellion. It was collapsing because someone had discovered how to profit from chaos and had spent years deliberately creating it. and that someone had stood beside the throne every single day. For nearly an hour, Garrick sat motionless, trying to process the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Then came the realization that hurt most. Severin had not acted entirely alone, because manipulation only succeeds when someone chooses to believe it. And Thorne had chosen, over and over, month after month, decision after decision, not from malice, not from corruption, from pride and fear, and the deeply human tendency to trust the voice that tells you what you already want to hear. The commander gathered every document, every ledger, every piece of evidence. Then he walked toward the throne room. It was the longest walk of his life. The king sat alone when Garrick arrived. A mountain of reports surrounded him. His face looked older than it had even weeks ago. The confidence that had once defined him eroding slowly, almost invisibly, in the way that only the people closest to someone can perceive. Garrick approached, placed the stack of documents on the table, and said 4 words. "You need to see this." Thorne frowned. The commander never sounded uncertain. Today he did. The king opened the first file, then another, then another. The silence grew heavier with every page. By the time he reached the final document, all the color had drained from his face. "This isn't possible." Garrick didn't answer, because they both knew it was. Thorne reviewed the evidence again and again, searching desperately for mistakes, for alternative explanations, for anything that would allow him to not believe what he was looking at. There were none. The mining crisis had been exaggerated. Tax records had been altered. Reports had been falsified. Witness statements had disappeared. Inspection findings had been rewritten before they reached the crown. The king slowly lowered the papers. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the kind of realization that arrives too late and cannot be unfelt. "Severin!" Garrick nodded. The single motion felt like a death sentence. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Thorne asked the question he already knew the answer to. "How long?" Garrick's voice was quiet. "Years." The word struck harder than any blade. Years, not weeks, not months. Years of manipulation. Years of lies. Years of decisions made from corrupted information, from a reality carefully constructed by a man whose only loyalty was to his own advancement. Years of believing he was protecting the kingdom, when in reality he had been helping to destroy it. The king stood abruptly, crossed the room, stopped beside the massive windows overlooking Stormhold. Below, the city continued moving. People working, merchants trading, children playing in streets that didn't know what was happening in the room above them. They had trusted him, and he had failed them. Not intentionally, but failure rarely becomes less painful simply because it wasn't deliberate. Then Garrick revealed something worse. Lyra knew. The king froze, then turned around slowly. "What?" The commander looked away, because even now the truth felt cruel. She knew something was wrong. The memory surfaced instantly, unbidden and merciless. Lyra asking questions during council meetings. Lyra requesting investigations. Lyra pushing for inspections. Lyra challenging reports. Lyra warning him, again and again and again, in every way she knew how. Every attempt he had dismissed. Every concern he had treated as unnecessary. Every time she had tried to protect him from exactly this. And suddenly the king wasn't seeing reports anymore. He was seeing her, standing beside the balcony, her voice gentle with the weight of something she had been carrying for too long. A kingdom falls when its people stop believing in their king. He remembered the exact moment, the exact expression, the exact way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with the particular sadness of someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth even when they know you won't hear it. For the first time he understood what she had been trying to save him from. Not rebellion, himself. The realization hollowed him out. But Garrick wasn't finished. There was still one truth left. The most devastating one. The commander reached into his cloak, pulled out a worn leather journal, placed it carefully on the table. The cover bore a familiar crest, a black wolf beneath a silver moon. Cassian's. Thorne's throat tightened instantly. "Where did you get this?" "A courier. It arrived 3 days ago." The king opened the journal. The pages were filled with notes, observations, village records, supply requests, names, hundreds of names, families, workers, children, widows, farmers, people the prince had been helping. Thorne turned page after page, and with every entry a picture emerged that was at once beautiful and devastating. Cassian had never abandoned the kingdom. He had stayed, not in palaces, not in castles, among the people, living beside them, working beside them, protecting them, organizing food shipments, building schools in villages that had never had one, repairing roads, negotiating disputes, helping people survive, doing the very things the crown should have been doing all along. Thorne stopped reading, his vision blurred, because he finally understood. Cassian hadn't run away. He had stepped forward. While the king moved further from his people, the prince moved closer. While the king protected his authority, the prince protected lives. While the king listened to Severin, the prince listened to the kingdom. And somehow, without a throne, without armies, without titles, without any of the instruments of power Thorne had spent his life accumulating, Cassian had become exactly the kind of ruler people needed, a better king. The realization nearly broke him, because every father dreams of his son surpassing him, but not like this. Not because of his own failures. Not because a boy had to leave home and disappear into the cold north just to become the man he was always meant to be. The room became the kind of silence that only exists after truth has finally destroyed every remaining excuse. Then Garrick spoke one final time. There was something else. The king looked up. The commander's face held the particular tightness of a man who wishes he could spare someone what he is about to say, but knows he cannot. Slowly, Garrick removed a folded piece of parchment from inside the journal. A letter, old, weathered, unopened. Cassian's final message, written specifically for his father. Thorne's hand shook as he accepted it. For several seconds, he couldn't bring himself to open it, because deep down, in the part of him that had always understood more than he allowed himself to admit, he already knew it would hurt. Finally, he unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page, and the world seemed to stop. 2 sentences, only 2. Do not look for me. The king's breathing became uneven. Then the final line, the one that shattered what remained. The father I loved no longer exists. Silence. Absolute silence. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Alpha King Thorne Blackwind understood, truly completely with nowhere left to hide, exactly what he had lost. The truth had finally been revealed, but the consequences were only beginning, and soon Thorne would leave the throne behind to search for the family he had driven away. There are defeats that happen on battlefields, and then there are defeats that happen inside a man's soul. The first kind leaves scars on the body. The second kind leaves wounds that never close entirely. The kind you carry for the rest of your life and only learn eventually to live with. For Alpha King Thorne Blackwind, the second defeat had finally arrived. The letter remained on his desk long after Garrick left the room. The father I loved no longer exists. The words came back again and again, the way some truths do, not fading with repetition, but sharpening. For years he had blamed rebels, traitors, disloyal nobles, external threats, misfortune, bad timing, everything except himself. The list of excuses was long and had served him well for longer than it should have. Now there was nowhere left to hide. No enemy remained, only the truth. And the truth was merciless. Outside Moonfang Palace, the kingdom was changing, not loudly, not in ways that looked like revolution, but in the quiet, steady way that water changes stone. The cracks that had once seemed small now spread across the Blackwind Dominion, like fractures spreading through ice that can no longer hold what it's being asked to hold. News of Lyra's exile had traveled farther than any royal decree. News of Cassian's disappearance had traveled farther still. And news of the king's failures traveled fastest of all, carried on every merchant's tongue, in every traveler's account, between every village that had been watching from a distance. The people had stopped whispering. Now they spoke openly. Entire villages refused tax collectors. Regional alphas delayed answering royal summons. Military commanders began ignoring orders they would once have followed without a second thought. The kingdom was no longer united. It was simply waiting, like a room that has emptied before the next person arrives, holding the particular silence of something between one era and the next. Inside the council chambers, the damage was worse. Empty chairs surrounded the great table. Dust gathered where nobles had once sat. Half the council had resigned. The remaining half spent more time arguing than governing. Every meeting felt smaller. Every order reached fewer people. Every decree carried less weight than the one before it. The throne still existed, but its power was evaporating, and everyone could feel it, the way everyone can feel the temperature drop before a storm arrives, including Thorne, especially Thorne. One cold autumn morning, another messenger arrived from the Western Territories. The young courier knelt before the throne with hands that trembled visibly, not from cold, but from the particular fear of being the person who delivers news that cannot be unsaid. "My king," Thorne already knew. He could hear it in the man's voice. Another province, another refusal, another piece of the dominion pulling quietly away. The courier swallowed. "House Evercrest has withdrawn support from the crown." Silence. Nobody reacted. Not because the news wasn't shocking, because everyone in the room had stopped being shocked by the same pattern repeating itself. The king dismissed the messenger, then sat alone for nearly an hour, staring at the throne beneath him, the same throne his father had protected, the same throne he had spent 20 years strengthening, the same throne that had begun to feel, more than anything else, like a prison he had built for himself. Finally he stood, walked down the steps, removed the royal signet ring from his finger, and placed it upon the armrest. The sound it made was soft, yet final. Garrick watched from the doorway. The old commander said nothing, because some moments require nothing but witness. Thorne turned toward him. "What happens if I leave?" Garrick looked genuinely surprised. The king had never asked that question before, had never been capable of asking it, because asking it would have required admitting that the kingdom might not need him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the commander answered honestly, "The kingdom will survive." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they landed like a verdict. Because once upon a time, Thorne had believed the kingdom would not survive without him, had believed that he and the throne were the same thing, that his strength was its strength, his will its foundation. And now a man who had never lied to him was telling him otherwise. Several days later, Alpha King Thorne Blackwind disappeared. No royal procession, no announcement, no ceremony, no guards, no banners, no crown. For the first time since becoming king, he traveled alone. Not as a ruler, as a man searching for the family he had lost, with no guarantee he would find them, and no certainty they would want to be found. The journey changed him. At first, people didn't recognize him. The heavy cloak hid his face. The years had added lines around his eyes. And without armor or attendants, he looked like any aging traveler, someone who had been on the road too long and carried something heavy in his expression, which meant people spoke freely, and what they said cut deeper than any sword ever had. In a small farming village near the southern hills, he sat beside an old woman repairing fishing nets. She never learned his identity, never suspected who he was. She simply spoke, the way people speak to strangers on a long afternoon when there's work to do and too much silence. "My son died during the Iron Hollow riots." The words hit him before he had time to prepare for them. The woman continued working, her hands moving with the automatic rhythm of someone who has had a long time to make peace with something that didn't deserve to be made peace with. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired in a way that went all the way down. He wasn't a rebel. She smiled sadly. He couldn't even hold a sword properly. Thorne lowered his eyes. The woman never noticed. He believed the crown would help. The silence that followed felt like standing in a room after the air has been removed. He died waiting. The king left before sunset. He couldn't bear to hear more. But there was always more. In another village, a blacksmith raising 3 children alone. In another town, farmers forced from land their families had worked for generations. In another settlement, widows who still lowered their voices when they mentioned the day royal soldiers had arrived. Every story carried a familiar pattern. Different names, different faces, same suffering, same consequences, same source, his crown, his decisions, his failures. Each conversation became another wound. Each village became another reckoning. Each mile became heavier than the one before, the weight accumulating in the way that guilt accumulates when you finally stop running from it. Months passed, then years. The search never stopped. Sometimes rumors surfaced. A young leader helping remote settlements. A mysterious organizer delivering food through harsh winters. A man with black-wind eyes who refused every title offered to him. Every trail pointed toward the same person, Cassian. Yet somehow the prince always remained one step ahead, as if he knew he was being followed and had decided that his father would have to earn the meeting. The kingdom slowly transformed during those years. Without anyone quite planning it, the people began following new leaders, village councils, regional alliances, community networks built from the bottom up, by people who had learned not to wait for the crown to save them. Many of them organized by one man, Cassian Blackwind, the prince who had disappeared, the heir who refused the throne, the son who had chosen people over power and never once looked back. And every story Thorne heard made his heart ache with a feeling he couldn't name, something between pride and grief and the specific anguish of a man who finally understands what he was looking at, long after the moment to act on it has passed. It happened in the 7th year, high in the northern territories, beyond the Frostpine Forest, beyond the old mining roads, in a place that most maps didn't bother to name. A small settlement rested beside a river valley, not wealthy, but thriving in the way that communities thrive when the people inside them genuinely care for one another. Children laughed openly. The roads were maintained. The houses were solid. Food stores were full. People smiled with the ease of those who are not afraid. The moment Thorne arrived, he felt something strange, something he had almost forgotten the feeling of. Hope. The feeling frightened him, because hope could still be taken away. An elderly farmer pointed toward the river. Looking for the council leader? The king's pulse quickened. What does he look like? The old man smiled. Tall. Thorne swallowed. Dark hair. His heart began pounding. Green eyes. Thorne froze. The farmer laughed. Best leader we've ever had. The king could barely breathe. For 7 years he had imagined this moment. Hundreds of times. Thousands. Yet now that it was finally here, he felt something he hadn't expected. Terror. Not of rejection, of confirmation, of finding out definitively whether his son had succeeded without him, and understanding in that moment what that meant. The king followed the river. The sound reached him first. Laughter, then voices, then the sight of dozens of villagers gathered beside newly built irrigation channels, working together with the particular energy of people engaged in something that matters. At the center stood a young man, 19 years old, broad-shouldered, confident with the quiet, earned confidence of someone who has learned their abilities the hard way. Dark hair touched by sunlight, green eyes scanning the workers around him with genuine attention. Not the measured attention of a ruler monitoring subjects, but the real attention of someone who cares about every person in his sight. People listened when he spoke, not because they feared him, because they trusted him. The sight nearly shattered Thorne where he stood. Cassian, his son, alive, healthy, respected. Everything he had prayed for through 7 years of searching, everything he had lost through 7 years of failure. For several moments he simply watched, unable to move, unable to speak, trying to memorize the image, to hold it still, to make it real. Then Cassian looked up. Their eyes met, and the world stopped. The prince froze. The workers fell silent one by one, sensing the change in the air. Nobody moved. Neither father nor son knew what to say, and both of them understood that 7 years of distance was not the kind of thing that words arrive easily across. Finally, Cassian dismissed the workers, slowly, quietly, until only the two of them remained beside the river. The water flowed past them, the wind moved through the trees, and silence stretched between them. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of two people who have too much to say and don't know where to begin. Thorne spoke first. His voice came out sounding older than he remembered it being. Cassian, the young man nodded. Father. No anger in the word, No bitterness. No cold satisfaction at being found after so long. For some reason, that hurt most of all. I've been looking for you. Cassian looked toward the river. I know. Another silence. Long, painful, the kind that belongs to situations that cannot be fixed quickly, if they can be fixed at all. Then Thorne asked the question that had haunted him for 7 years. Why didn't you come home? The prince closed his eyes briefly, not from frustration, from a sadness that had clearly been sitting with him for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Because home stopped being a place where people mattered. The words shattered something inside the king, not because they were cruel, because they were true. Thorne's breath caught, his vision blurred. Every memory he had been carrying came flooding back at once. Lyra's warnings, the villagers, the riots, the council, the exile, the letter. Every decision, every mistake, every moment he had chosen pride over people and told himself it was wisdom. The king sank onto a nearby wooden bench. His shoulders trembled. The man who had never bowed before enemies, the warrior who had faced armies, the ruler who had stared down rival kings and made them choose different futures. He broke. Not as an alpha, not as a king, as a father, which is the only way a man can truly break. Tears filled his eyes, then spilled. The first tears Cassian had ever seen from him. The prince stood motionless, watching, not triumphant, not satisfied, heartbroken because he had never wanted this. He had wanted his father, the father from before, the father who taught him to ride and carried him on broad shoulders and believed that protecting people was the most important thing a man could do. That father seemed very far away now. Eventually, Thorne looked up. His voice barely worked. I'm sorry. The words felt small, pathetic, insufficient in every way that mattered. Yet they were all he had, the only true thing left after everything else had been stripped away. Cassian stared at him. For a moment, something fragile flickered between them, the possibility of a door that might still open. Then the prince's expression changed, the sadness deepened, and suddenly Thorne knew, in the wordless, certain way that parents know, that something was wrong, very wrong. Cassian looked away, toward the mountains, toward the horizon, toward some truth he clearly didn't want to carry into this conversation, but had no choice. What is it? No answer. Cassian. Still silence. The prince swallowed, then finally spoke. His voice cracked on the first word. Father! The king stood immediately. Fear surged through him. Primal. Immediate. The fear that belongs only to parents. Cassian met his eyes and delivered the words that destroyed whatever remained of the man Thorne used to be. Mother is dying. Silence. The river continued flowing. The wind continued moving through the pines. The world continued turning, indifferent to the fact that for Thorne Blackwyn, everything had just stopped. There are victories that change kingdoms, and there are moments that change men. For Alpha King Thorne Blackwyn, the throne no longer mattered. The kingdom no longer mattered. The crown no longer mattered. Only Lyra. Only the woman he had loved and failed, and driven away, and spent 7 years trying to find again. Not to explain himself, not to justify what he had done, but simply to look at her and say the things that pride had kept locked inside him for too long. Mother is dying. Cassian had spoken those words moments ago, yet they already felt carved into him permanently. For 7 years, Thorne had lived with regret. Now regret had a deadline. The moment the words left Cassian's mouth, the king moved. Not with royal dignity, not with measured authority, with desperation, the kind that strips away everything unnecessary and reveals exactly who a person is. Where is she? His voice cracked on the question. Cassian looked toward the distant mountains. There is a monastery near the eastern highlands. He paused, and the pause carried everything. The healers have done everything they can. Thorne mounted his horse before the silence could finish settling. No speech, no goodbye, no careful arrangement of what came next. He simply rode, because there was no time left for anything else. The journey took 4 days, 4 endless days of racing through forests and across rivers and over mountain passes in the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there, through villages that once would have welcomed him as their king. He barely noticed them now, everything blurred, the landscape, the cold, the distance. Only one thought remained, repeating itself with every hoofbeat. Please, not yet, please. The eastern highlands rose from the horizon on the morning of the fifth day. Snow covered the peaks. Ancient stone roads wound between cliffs worn smooth by centuries of winter. And nestled among them, overlooking a valley of silver pines, stood a small monastery. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place people come to make peace with the end. The sight filled Thorne with terror, because beautiful places are often chosen for final goodbyes. By the time he reached the gates, his horse was exhausted. So was he, not with physical tiredness, but with the weight of everything he had been carrying for 7 years, arriving all at once. He dismounted before the animal had fully stopped moving. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing, trying to prepare himself for the possibility that he had arrived too late, or the possibility that he had arrived just in time to watch something end. Then the gates opened, and Cassian stepped forward. The prince had ridden ahead by another route, knowing his father would come. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Cassian nodded toward the monastery. "She's waiting." Those two words nearly broke him. Waiting, not gone, not already past reaching, waiting. The king entered. The monastery was quiet, not silent, but peaceful in the way that places become peaceful when they have held a great deal of suffering and learned to hold it gently. The halls smelled of herbs and candle wax. Soft light filtered through tall windows. Somewhere distant, monks recited prayers in a low, steady murmur that felt strangely comforting. A healer led him through corridors and past open courtyards and through stone archways until finally they stopped before a simple wooden door. The healer bowed his head, then left, and Thorne stood alone with his hand against the wood, unable to move. For years he had imagined this moment, the reunion, the apology, the chance to say what he should have said before everything fell apart. He had rehearsed it in 100 different ways during 100 different nights on the road. Now that it was here, he was afraid, not of rejection, of forgiveness, because forgiveness would require him to stand fully inside everything he had done and not flinch from any of it. Slowly he opened the door. The room was small and simple, white stone walls warmed by sunlight, fresh flowers on a nearby table, a window that looked out over the valley of silver pines. Everything in it had been chosen for peace, and beside the window sat Lyra. For one terrible second, Thorne almost didn't recognize her, not because her face had changed, but because illness had taken something from her that he hadn't anticipated. She looked thinner, frailer, older in ways that had nothing to do with years, yet somehow more peaceful than he had ever seen her. She turned toward the door and smiled, the same smile, the same gentle warmth that had been the most reliable thing in his world for 20 years before he threw it away. Tears filled his eyes immediately. Neither moved, neither spoke. The years between them became visible in that silence, a river neither of them quite knew how to cross. Finally, Lyra spoke. "You look terrible." A broken, completely involuntary laugh escaped him. The queen smiled wider. And somehow that small, ordinary exchange hurt more than any accusation could have, because there was no hatred in her eyes, only sadness, and something that might, impossibly, still be love. Thorne crossed the room slowly, stopped beside her chair. For a moment he simply looked at her, trying to memorize everything, trying to make up in a handful of seconds for 7 years of absence. Then Lyra reached out and took his hand. The touch nearly destroyed him. The woman he had hurt most, the woman who had the most reason to turn away, still reached for him, still offered comfort, still cared. The king sank to his knees beside her chair, just as he had knelt before the ruined throne in the empty palace. But this was different in every way that mattered. Lyra squeezed his hand gently. "I heard you've been traveling." A soft, sad laugh. "I've been learning." She studied him with the particular attention of someone who is seeing the full picture for the first time, then nodded. "As painful as I imagined?" He closed his eyes. Worse. For several moments, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the open window. Birds sang somewhere outside. The world held itself very still. Then Lyra said the words he would carry for the rest of his life. I never stopped loving you. The king's breath caught. His entire body stilled. Then came the second sentence, the one that hurt even more. I only stopped recognizing you. The words settled between them, heavy and gentle and devastating in equal measure, because they were true, not cruel, not angry, simply, quietly, entirely true. And truth has a way of reaching the places that nothing else can reach. Thorne lowered his head. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time ever, he stopped defending himself, stopped justifying, stopped explaining, stopped performing the version of himself that he had spent decades maintaining. Instead, he told the truth. All of it. The lies he had chosen to believe. The pride that had made him so easy to manipulate. The mistakes that had compounded into each other like stones into an avalanche. The fear beneath the anger beneath the pride. Every failure, every decision, every moment he had chosen power when he should have chosen people. When he finished, the room felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because it was no longer hidden, no longer locked inside the place where things that cannot be admitted do their worst damage in the dark. Lyra listened to everything, without interruption, without judgment, without condemnation. Then she squeezed his hand one more time and smiled. Not because she approved of what he had done, because she understood him. And sometimes understanding is the closest thing to forgiveness we are able to receive. Weeks later, the kingdom witnessed something it had not expected. The fall of Lord Severin Dravenmore. The investigation was swift, merciless, public in a way that Severin, who had spent his career operating in shadow, had never imagined being exposed to. Years of corruption emerged like light finding a room that has been sealed for too long. Forged reports, manipulated tax records, stolen resources, secret accounts that had swelled with every crisis he had engineered. Every lie uncovered another. Every crime exposed 10 more. The people watched in disbelief as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. The villain they had blamed was not the king alone. It had been the man whispering beside him, patient, elegant, relentless, and utterly without conscience. Severin's fortune was seized, his titles stripped, his estates confiscated. His allies abandoned him with the speed of people who had never truly been loyal to anything except his power. His family name was removed from the noble records. Within a single season, one of the most influential men in the kingdom became a cautionary tale. Yet the greatest surprise came afterward, because once Severin fell, everyone expected Thorne to reclaim power. The throne still stood. The kingdom still needed leadership. The people would have accepted him back, perhaps not with enthusiasm, but with the weary understanding of those who have been through enough to know that imperfect redemption is still redemption. They were wrong. On the first day of spring, representatives from every territory gathered at Moonfang Palace. The great hall overflowed with nobles and pack leaders and merchants and commanders and ordinary citizens who had walked long distances to be present for whatever was about to happen. The throne stood at the center of the chamber, empty for the final time. Thorne entered wearing simple black clothing, no crown, no royal armor, no symbols of the power he had spent his life accumulating. Only honesty, which is the heaviest thing a man can carry and the lightest, once he finally sets everything else down. The room became silent. The former king approached the throne, looked at it for a long moment, at the iron and silver and centuries of history it represented, with the expression of someone taking leave of something they have finally understood. Then he turned toward the crowd and did something no one expected. He refused the throne. The gas spread through the hall instantly, shock, confusion, disbelief rippling from person to person like a wave moving through still water. Yet the former king remained calm. His voice came out steady and clear. I spent years believing the kingdom belonged to me. Silence. I was wrong. The room fell utterly still. The kingdom belongs to the people. He turned toward Cassian, standing beside Garrick, beside Lyra, beside the future that had somehow survived what he had done to the past, and smiled. The Black Wind Dominion deserves a better king. Then he stepped aside, and the hall exploded, not with anger, not with confusion, but with something that had been waiting a very long time to find its way back into that room. Hope. Cassian Blackwind approached the throne, the boy who had walked away, the young man who had served without a title, the prince who had chosen people over power and been proven right by everything that followed, the heir his father had lost and the kingdom had found, the ruler it had been waiting for. When the crown was placed upon Cassian's head, thousands cheered, not because a new king had simply risen to fill a vacancy, but because the right one had. Everyone in the hall could feel the difference. Some things you recognize without being able to explain why. Years passed. The kingdom healed. Not all at once. Healing never happens all at once, but steadily the way rivers fill after long drought. The mining provinces recovered. Trade flourished. Villages that had once refused the crown's collectors now welcomed its emissaries. The wounds of the past faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. On the 10th anniversary of Cassian's coronation, a great celebration filled Stormhold. Thousands gathered in the capital. Music moved through the streets. Children played beneath banners that flew in colors the city had chosen itself. Merchants filled the plazas. The kingdom had become something close to what Lyra had once dreamed it could be. At the center of it all stood King Cassian Blackwind, confident, wise, respected in the way that only those who have earned it can ever truly be. Loved, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because the people who loved him had chosen to, freely, every day. And among the crowd stood an older man, gray-haired, weathered, completely anonymous. No crown, no throne, no title, only a father watching his son succeed in a way that would outlast both of them. Nearby, a young child tugged at Cassian's sleeve. "Your Majesty?" The king looked down. The child pointed toward the older man in the crowd. Was he really the great Alpha King, Thorne Blackwind? The crowd grew quiet. Many turned, waiting. Cassian followed the child's gaze, toward his father, toward the man who had fallen so far, and then, slowly, without fanfare, and without anyone owing him the chance, had found his way back to something worth being. A soft smile appeared. "No," the child blinked, confused. Cassian's eyes never left his father. "He was something far more important." The crowd listened. The former king looked away, unable to hide the thing that had come into his eyes. Cassian smiled softly and delivered the final truth. "He was the man who taught me what a king should never become." The hall held the words in silence for a long moment, not because they were cruel, because they were honest, and because everyone present understood what lived inside them. The full weight of what it had taken to arrive at this moment, the mistakes, the loss, the long, painful journey back. Without Thorne's failures, there would have been no lesson. Without his fall, there would have been no Cassian. Without his regret, the real kind, the kind that changes a man all the way through, there would have been no redemption. And sometimes the greatest legacy a ruler leaves behind is not the kingdom he built, but the wisdom his failures pass on to those who come after him. The kingdom endured, the family healed, the throne survived, and for the first time in a very long time, so did the man who once lost everything.